It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to participate. It's been a great start to the day, and I'm sort of in awe here of being surrounded by these data specialists. And I'm really at the lower level of this food web. I'm going to give you a view from the trenches there as maybe a data practitioner, because I think for the majority of research scientists, data per se is not the thing that's really interesting. It's really the ideas that have led to the data, or the things that you can do with the data and the hypotheses that you're generating. But of course, data management is a very important part of that whole process, and more we need to grapple with some of the challenges associated with that. So some of the things I'd like to talk about are good and bad models for data management, and why should researchers really care about data management? And so what? What can we do with a reasonable data management? What is it all about? I've been asked to talk a little bit about a data resource that we have, a wonderful resource that you'll hear more about this afternoon, called the Paula Data Catalog, and a little bit about how that came into being and some of the forces that led to that. A collaboration with the University of Waterloo and also with Université Laval and ArcticNet. And then some of the challenges that we faced in implementing this database and the process, some of the stormy ups and downs, and some of the things that you have to confront as you get into the data management area, some of the lessons that we may have learned. So let's start with models, and let's start with a bad model. We've already heard a little bit about the International Polar Year. Now, the International Polar Year is a large-scale collaborative international program to research the polar regions. And it was mentioned earlier on today that actually the recent Polar Year was a real success story. That wasn't always the case. And so the first International Polar Year was in 1882 to 1883. And people were distributed around actually in both polar regions. It's very dangerous work actually in that epoch. And there are little bits and pieces of data that are available, and those data sets that are available are just fascinating. There was data collected, for example, here up in the north from Scandinavia, from Greenland. A little bit of data made its way through from Ellesmere Island, which is an area that I work in each year. And when all of that was put together, and it took over 100 years for that data set, that synthesis to take place, it was found that in fact the climatology at that time was consistent with what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the waves of the planetary waves that move around the Arctic basin, the oscillations that take place, and the variability that appears to be within the more recent climatological range. But unfortunately, there are only a few scraps of data available from that time, and that is a real pity. Because right at the moment, we are seeing huge changes in the north of Canada. And if we had that reference source, that baseline to compare against, that would be so incredibly important in terms of policy decisions, in terms of understanding global change. And so one of our first data managers is this character. This is Commander Adolphus Greely, and he led the first International Polar Year expedition to northern Canada for the up there in the 1880s. And unfortunately, the Greely model is not ideal because he had no data plan. And so as a consequence, very little of that data is available to us today. Even simple observations like the state of the ice or the state of the flora and the fauna, those would be extremely valuable to us today. But I should say, Commander Greely had one or two other somewhat difficult problems in his managerial strategy, including a number of aspects here, culminating in cannibalism and summary execution. And so, along with bad data management, he had a lot of things to answer for. So when the International Polar Year came through and Ellsworth Ledru co-chaired the IPY Data Management Committee, they felt that the Greely model perhaps was not a suitable model in which to base the activities in 2007, 2008. And so we ended up with a very different perspective on how to deal with this issue and a way to go forward. So there are some bad models out there, but there are also some very good models. One aspect of that relates to a type of data set that is becoming increasingly important in my domain, which is in microbiology. And so we had a program in the International Polar Year. It was called MERGE, which was all about microbial ecosystem responses to changes in the global environment. And we included a component here on the right-hand side, characterizing Arctic microbial environments in a rapidly warming climate, a whole variety of different sorts of physical and chemical and biological measurements. And those are gradually coming through, I think, in terms of data management with some of the resources that are available. But the real success in terms of data repository and data sharing really came through another mechanism, and that is through DNA analysis. So part of our work also was examining the diversity of life forms up in these northern waters, coastal waters, fjords, lakes, and rivers. And the reason that this is so important is that if you look at a little drop of water or a little bit of soil and stain it with DNA, with a DNA stain, what you see is something like that galaxy we saw this morning. It's this incredible inner world. In a liter of water is a billion DNA-containing cells. And the richness, the diversity, we've always suspected is substantial. But we've never had a way to ask the question, what's there and what is it doing? And it has been the last 5 to 10 years with genomics tools, initially developed in the medical sciences, that we've been able to go out into the natural environment and ask those very simple-minded questions. And the results are extraordinary. And we're seeing that we're starting to see these different communities from the three domains of life snapping into focus. And we see that out there in the natural world, there is a diversity, not only in terms of taxonomic diversity, in terms of species diversity, there is an extraordinary functional richness of life on planet Earth that is basically our life support system. Most of the life on planet Earth, we realize now, is invisible, at least invisible to our naked eye. But the diversity is spectacular. And each year we're learning more about that diversity. So our approach there is to use these DNA techniques and RNA techniques, molecular tools. And the requirement in the approach in environmental microbiology, you extract the DNA from your samples, from single cells or from different populations or from the whole community. And then you use specific genes that tell you about, that give you a label essentially as to what's there. And you end up with these long base sequences, which on the face of it are pretty boring data sets. What is really interesting about these data sets is that you're then able to analyze what's there by way of a database. And that database is called GenBank. And the requirement is that if you wish to publish your data in environmental microbiology, you have to contribute your data to that data bank, and you get an accession number, and that accession number has to be placed in your manuscript before the editor will even send it out for review. It's a requirement. It's the norm in environmental microbiology these days. And it's a fantastic thing. And of course, you have metadata that goes in there. I think the standards have improved over the last decade or so in terms of the requirement for metadata. And this database is incredible. It is now, here we're on a log scale. It's been coming up more or less exponentially over the last 3 decades. And now from your laptop, when you get your data set, from your laptop or from your smartphone, you're now able, as of this month, able to access 158 million sequences to compare your data. And that's, without that comparative database, all you have is a string of nucleotides, which means nothing. So that's a pretty neat resource for us. For example, in our International Polar Year program, we were very interested in a group of microbes called Cyanobacteria. And these are organisms that have been around for 3.5 billion years. They live in all manner of interesting places, including in the Arctic and in Antarctica, where sometimes they are the dominant components of ecosystems. And so we wanted to know, well, what are some of the relationships here between these different species of cyanobacteria? So we applied this approach using these DNA techniques, extracting the DNA, and then making that comparison with that 150 million base pairs. And this was work by our postdoc on IPY, Anna Jungblut. And amazingly, she found that she put in these samples from Ellesmere Island at the top of Canada, and all of a sudden uplighted on the screen these other hits where other people have been working, and keeping in mind that it could have lit up anywhere on planet Earth, but alpine environments, samples that have been analyzed from McMurdo down here in Antarctica, thought to be endemic up to that time to Antarctica, found only in Antarctica, and found here in the Lasman Hills on the other side of Antarctica. And that suggested to us the hypothesis that there is a cold biosphere out there at a planetary scale, and there are these organisms that are highly adapted, and they are the same organisms, or genetically very similar organisms that are the cold lovers of the cold biosphere. So that's pretty neat. And in fact, I asked Anna, I said, wow, what was that like when you typed in your DNA sequence, or you put in your DNA sequences and the screen lit up? And she said it was spooky. And she has a Kiwi Australian accent, so it was even spookier when she said that. And you couldn't do that without good data management at this planetary scale that we now have in genomics. And I think that's an example of where we should be going in data sharing and data management. So why should we care about data management just in general? Well, the first is we want to preserve the data for synthesis. We know that these syntheses are important, particularly our students have grown up in the era of IPCC and collaborative programs at an international level. It makes sense that data gets out there. The Greely model is not good, but the idea is there that 100 years later, people may be looking at our data, and there may be some very important stories to tell concerning that. We know that those data sets are important as a reference against which we can place our own work in a context that thereby makes our own work make a lot more sense, or in the case of the molecular side, makes it make any sense at all. So that reference approach is important. Because data management can facilitate collaboration. We're seeing some of that with the International Polar Year, where people are contacting us saying, well, you've got that data set and we've got some other data sets. Maybe we can work together and combine them and come up with an overall kind of pattern. This is particularly important to us when we work out in the field, for example, in an oceanographic cruise, where a mission where different people are collecting different sorts of data sets. We want to know what the salinity and the temperature is, but that's a big job for somebody to collect that. And we want to be able to make that link to the plankton, and then somebody else is working on whales, and somebody else is working on links to local communities. And we'd really like to be able to fit those data sets together to really be able to understand what's happening. And that's where the collaborative opportunities come up. And you need to know what the data are to be out there. They can catalyze discovery. This is certainly true for GenBank, where you can, the GenBank, incidentally, it's run by the National Institutes of Health. It's an open access database, like the best of the databases. And it comes with a whole variety of interrogation tools, these user tools that we heard about, that allow you to ask questions. What if? What are some of the relationships there? And as was referred to earlier, there are people who have never been into the field, who never want to go into the field, actually, to get up in the ends of the earth, but who are now able to address very interesting questions by virtue of the data sets that are around. They should really talk to the people who have been in the field as well to give them a little bit of ground truthing. Of course, there's an ethical responsibility in that our data are being produced through public monies, and for the certainly scientists are ethical people. I mean, this is the nature where our aim is to try to get closer to the truth, and that involves being ethical in terms of what you're reporting and what you're seeing and what you're not seeing, and figuring out the limits of your data, etc. And ethics is an important part of that. But of course, when it comes to that ethical responsibility, and we sometimes use that in talking to our students and others, but of course everyone is so busy, and there's a limit to the number of minutes in a life. So people have to work strategically in terms of what's important, and there may not be the time available to actually get those data sets out and made available to other colleagues in Canada or elsewhere around the world. So this is where we think that requirement for funding is especially important. There needs to be some encouragement. There has to be the carrot and stick approach to to really encourage the coming to the party to present that data. And that we don't have a history of that in Canada. It's really just starting, and I think the International Polar Year was one example where we were encouraged to move in that direction, to really think about what is your data plan and how will you make available those data for the future. One of the few examples of this is the new Discovery Frontiers program by NSERC, where the work was specifically, this particular call for proposals was focused on the north, and the aim being to work in an integrated manner amongst different collaborators, tackle broad problems defined with the input of the northern community. And it was explicitly stated, and I think this related to that IPY experience, that a data management plan would be a component that would be examined. And it's very interesting. So we have one of these programs, the first of these programs concerning permafrost, and we've just gone through our initial first year reporting process, and the report has gone out for review and probably international review, and one of the first questions is, well, what is now the data status and the data plan? And as you move around internationally, you realize that there are other nations that are well ahead of us. The Long-Term Ecological Research Program in the United States, for example, where there is funding towards examining long-term effects on ecosystems, all sorts of ecosystems, including urban ecosystems. From an early stage, there was a funding block for data management and data exchange. So in Canada, I think we're gradually moving in that direction, but it's an opportune time to continue the momentum. In our case, for this program, we call it ADAPT, which is all about Arctic development and adaptation to permafrost in transition. The reason for this focus is that permafrost is such an important part of the circumpolar region. It's also an important part of Canada. About 50% of Canada actually lies on permafrost. Canada is a permafrost nation. We need to know about this, and we need to be able to exchange data about information about permafrost because it affects so many parts of our northern systems. It has a major influence on hydrology, for example, and water quality. And if we are affecting water quality, then that's a key question for northern communities. It affects the plant life and animal life on the tundra, including these berry species, which are nutritionally important for northern communities. They're also a very important part of the networking of northern communities, with the exchanges between networking among women who work out on the tundra, collecting these berries and exchanging about maybe solving some of the problems that the men have created back in the villages. So it's a very important cultural aspect as well, but again affected by permafrost. We know that this permafrost also has planetary significance. The estimates now are that about half the organic carbon in the world, in the soil carbon of the world, is stored in these frozen permafrost soils. And if liberated, that would be enough to raise carbon dioxide levels by a factor of 3. So we need to understand, well, what is the liability of that material, and to what extent can those materials be transferred into greenhouse gases? So we work, for example, on these lakes. Part of my own work is on these lakes in the tundra that act as digesters that are converting this ancient carbon into greenhouse gases. And then there is a major influence on infrastructure, because so much of what we built in the north back in the 50s and 60s and 70s was on this basis for the engineers that they were building on rock. Unfortunately, that rock was H2O, and it has another phase. They were building on ice containing soil. So today there are concerns by many communities about the stability of the land in which they live, in which they have roads, runways, foundations, port facilities, and industries. So within ADAPT, that also involves engineers. So that's another aspect of the diversity of data that has to be exchanged, of vital relevance to ultimately putting to work that information to generate strategies for development and for adaptation. And that is of special relevance given that permafrost is now changing. The sea ice, you've read a lot about that or heard a lot about that. The sea ice was at an all-time minimum this last year. Well, that sea ice is also acting as a refrigerator for the land. And as we're losing the refrigerator, where the land is warming up and the permafrost is becoming unstable, we don't actually know what the shape of that curve is beyond this, the present, but we know that the trend line is down, and we need to be ready for that. Additionally, the North is experiencing rapid economic development, extraordinary development when you go to the North in terms of mining and tourism and the service industry. So again, we need to be in a position to exchange that data and make that information available to a great variety of different sorts of stakeholders who are then going to be putting that information to work and working with those stakeholders as well. So we have this long list here about why we should care about data management. The requirement, increasingly we're seeing that it's beginning in Canada, increasingly internationally it's a requirement for funding. It was a requirement for funding in the International Polar Year throughout the world. But perhaps most importantly, the data really is there to meet the needs of the user community. And when we're thinking about data management, we should not be thinking about putting this one-way transport into a locked box. We really need to figure out how we're going to be able to get that information out so it helps people and exchanges and maximizes the science and engineering and technology and other areas, and how it maximizes the use of that information. And so that brings me to the Polar Data Catalog, which is an outgrowth of many of those concerns about how do we make that interface. And at our level, at the ArcticNet and Université Laval side of things, that began with us in an oceanographic program called the Canadian Arctic Shelf Exchange Study. And this was a time in which we obtained funds to re-equip an icebreaker, which we renamed the Amundsen, refitted it, and in particular to freeze this ship into the ice for a year to obtain a full season's data. And up until this time, we had this idea that the Arctic Ocean starts at the end of the academic year, and then it's very active there while we're there, and just before classes start again in fall, then it stops, and then it's into this sort of suspended state of motion there, awaiting our return. So we really wanted to understand more what was happening in the Arctic Ocean throughout the year and its dynamics. And to give you an idea of the diversity of data that's collected in these sorts of oceanographic missions, on board the ship, there are around 40 scientists operating at a time, and each of those scientists is collecting different sorts of data. There's a lot of data collected while the ship is underway. Vitally important data, actually, about places like our Northwest Passage. We're grappling with the challenge at the moment of dealing with 4 terabytes of data associated with those underway operations. So there's profiling data, there's sediment data, a whole variety of different sounding systems to measure bottom sediments and the nature of those sediments. There are different sorts of instruments deployed in the water to collect the particles, to examine what the relationship is with the sediments. Other instruments are put in there to measure currents in the water, the salinity of the water, the way in which these different water masses are moving around, different sorts of environmental probes, different nets, of course, because we have biologists on board, along with the physicists and the chemists, trying to figure out what the food web looks like, including the microbiological side of that food web, collecting different sizes of plankton to put all that together. And actually, my favorite part of the Amundsen is that when we set it up with the CFI, a hole was cut in the base of the hull to allow the ship to be locked into the ice, but to allow sampling through the middle of the ship throughout the course of that winter. And I have to say that a number of people were quite concerned about that operation, including my son, who is a theoretical physicist, who explained to me, he said, you know, theory tells us that putting a hole in the bottom of a ship does not end well. And I said, yeah, don't worry about this. We work with the Canadian Coast Guard. I think they've thought about this. And so that's, but the point is that a lot of data is collected. It's heterogeneous data, and we need to exchange that data to make a story, to be able to figure out what's going on in the ecosystem. Each little piece of that data actually is not very meaningful unto itself. It's the bigger picture. So we need to have that, that combination of data. And also there are 12 laboratories on board the ship. This is really the de facto Canadian high Arctic research station that moves around across the Arctic each year and collects a huge amount of data, and then a lot of that data is generated also back home in different laboratories across Canada and across the world, because these are all international programs. So we have, maybe it's not a tsunami, but it's getting ready for a tsunami. It's an ocean of data that we have to deal with. And we've had some great people involved with this. Leah Braithwaite, who is at Fisheries and Oceans, to help us in the initiation of this. Jose Michaud, who's in the audience here, who's our data specialist at ArcticNet, really trying to figure out ways to access that data and facilitate the use of that information by everyone. And that then graded into another program which was even more ambitious, called ArcticNet. And this involved the 3 granting councils, actually. And you know, people tend to think of the natural sciences as being the same thing, but boy, you know, try to get a biologist and a geologist talking to each other. That's already a challenge. But we realized as we moved into the other sciences, the medical sciences and the social sciences, that also requires a lot of effort to figure out common languages, and it's not English or French necessarily, to figure out how because there are different ways of looking at the world and different sorts of issues concerning data and data management. So this program, ArcticNet, it's interdisciplinary with those intersectorial. It's concerned about the changing coastal Canadian environment. An aim is to develop integrated regional impact studies to figure out, well, what are the changes taking place and so what? What are the implications of those? What does that mean in terms of adaptation strategies for the future, in terms of development of industry in the future? And that requires really sharing the data. And the very first cruise in ArcticNet was in 2004, and it was just right on the heels of cases finishing. The ship turned around in Churchill and headed right back out to sea again, and that was the Nunavik Inuit Health Survey, focused on the 14 villages in the north of Quebec and Nunavik. So some real challenges. So why do we need this database? Well, part of it was this exchange. As scientists, we needed to be able to figure out what other people were doing who we were working with. We also needed to work closely and wanted to work closely with the northern communities. And this is something that we had heard, and I've been working in the Arctic for 20 years, and from the very beginning, when you go up to these northern communities and you do various outreach things, the first thing you hear is, well, yeah, we know about you scientists, you come up with the geese and you do something and then you leave. We know what the geese were doing, but what are you guys doing? And how do we access that information in the future? And it's a legitimate, I think a legitimate concern. And so our Inuit advisors who lived in the communities underscored that one of the main knowledge gaps was really trying to come up with something that the communities could access to figure out what's going on in their backyard. And some really remarkable advances have been made in that area, thanks to the Polar Data Catalog and the people here at the University of Waterloo and through input from ArcticNet. And the key link for us, there was a parallel river that was operating, another St. Lawrence River in parallel to that oceanographic river, and that was the Canadian Cryospheric Information Network based here at the University of Waterloo. This is something that Ellsworth initiated in the mid-1990s through a collaborative partnership with Canadian Space Agency, Environment Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and also working with industry, specifically Noetics Research. And we saw a natural partnership there that this was a focus on the cryosphere, but for us, we needed to get the biosphere in there and also people into this overall equation and to look at ways in which we could maximize our exchanges. And that has turned out to be a really wonderful collaboration across the country. And you'll hear more about that this afternoon. I think Julie Friedel is going to be presenting this afternoon. And so we started off in a very simple-minded way with a meta-database. We called it the ArcticNet Cases. So this Cases was this Canada Arctic Exchange study where we focused on input editing, archiving, searching. We had this Cases Data Committee chaired by the DFO, senior policy person Leah Braithwaite, the ArcticNet Data Management Committee chaired by Doug Bancroft, who was director of the Canadian Ice Services, and then joining forces with CCIN, the Canadian Cryospheric Information Network, led by Ellsworth, this expertise to bring together. And what CCIN was able to bring was the wonderful technological backbone to this, and the people here from CCIN today and PDC, well, this is like showing them a steam engine, you know, because today they have like the Lamborghini version that's moving at high speed, but a lot of work went in that initial stage to get the show on the road and the different servers. Again, this is going back into history, and there have been vast improvements that we've heard about actually the last couple of days. And so this came together, and a real turbo thrust to all this was from the International Polar Year Committee that said, we don't like the Greely model. We're going to do better than that. And the Polar Data Catalog is really the way in which we can move forward. And so the federal government, through IPY, gave the Polar Data Catalog a real turbo thrust to help it continue on today, with now ongoing support from different partners, and especially from ArcticNet. And that the result is this catalog. It's designed for information sharing among researchers and with northern stakeholders. That aspect is important, and Julie probably will be talking about some important upgrades that really facilitate that goal that we had. So that was the important and I think the very positive aspect of this process. But there were some real challenges along the way. And in terms of knowledge transfer and this idea of databasing, because there had been no history of exchanging data in Canada. And so as in this Nature report, they say, sharing data is great, but sharing my data? Wow, that's something else. It's, it's like the Queen Isabella statement that just after her marriage, what is yours is mine and what is mine is mine. What a perfect marriage. And so, clearly we needed a lot of work to be done, and it was difficult. There was no tradition, and for a lot of people there was this sense of loss that was talked about this morning, that something's being taken away in terms of ownership. So that's clearly something that needs to be addressed very carefully, that attribution and identifying who is responsible and who gets the credit for that data. In terms of student theses, again, this is a very important aspect, to make sure that students have prior access to their data, and that there is a respect of their requirements. So the way our approach towards that is really to focus in the short term on metadata, descriptions of the data, to allow the PI or the laboratory to really be the control point for access to the data, to involve the students. And the students were just a real motor. This is like, wow, yeah, other people are going to use our data. That's a really great thing. But then, of course, that also has to be modulated by the fact that for the professor running the laboratory, there are questions like tenure and promotion and all these things that relate to how your CV is developing. So there has to be the respect of that process as well. But the students have really embraced this process, and the hiring rate, I think, at the moment of young people also is going to indicate that we're moving into a new area. That aspect of attribution, one approach towards that is by way of DOEs, ascribing DOEs or assigning DOEs to data sets, which means that you can list those then in your CV, and also that they will be cited relative to your name. And so we've been working with DataCite on this and through the National Research Council. In our own case, that was of concern to us in our center, the Centre for Northern Studies, because among other things, we run a set of bases here throughout research stations throughout Eastern Canada, and we have a network of monitoring stations. And we want that data to be available, but we'd like a little credit for that as well. And that's important to show that back to our funding agencies, that this is being used and this is where the data are coming from. And so our approach and process there is to develop a data journal that we're calling Nordicana, where each issue will have a DOE ascribed to it, and then you can drill down into that and actually access the data. So that's the first question. How do you get attribution? This is a very important element. Another important aspect is that academics and researchers in general are very busy people. There's a limited amount of time, and if you're working in the north, and I know this is true in other areas, many other areas as well, but if you're working in the north, you've got about 15 or 20 different reports and and permits and et cetera that you have to put together over the course of a year. They're all particularly time consuming. So now we're saying, and also we want your metadata record, and we'd like to have your data input. So the PI has to see some value to that. Part of that is to make it a requirement. Part of that is to emphasize, well, this is something that a lot of people are going to be using in the future, so it's a real investment to maximizing the visibility of your work and maximizing the return on that investment. One of our ways of addressing that within the Polar Data Catalog and the metadata originally is to really work on the input forms, to reduce the amount of work for the PI or for the person inputting. And we had this rule that every time you met to develop this form, you should figure out how to shorten the form. It's sort of the opposite of Inland Revenue Canada. You know, it's how can you actually simplify things and minimize that time sitting around it, but still respecting international data standards and really getting a lot of things happening behind the scenes, which is what Polar Data Catalog has been able to do to make that available. Another question is liability. Who's responsible for that data, and what happens if somebody, some big international, multinational company uses your data set, makes a business decision with your data set? Who's liable? Actually, the events in Italy this week raised that whole liability issue to another level as well. So we realized from our consultation with a variety of people, including IP lawyers, that we would have to get legal advice. There are some quite tricky liability issues, and so if you go into our website there, you'll have to click on agree or disagree. If you disagree, they'll say, well, yeah, please don't use our data set. Where you get a one-time license through CCIN and through ArcticNet to use these data, and it was of great strife to me that I had to use some of my precious research dollars to hire a lawyer to work with this, but it was an important component of this overall process of data sharing. And then there are these questions of privacy that came up this morning, and that really came to the fore when we talked to the health sciences people. Clearly, there are data sets there that are to be only available to the chief medical officer of a particular area, or there have to be clear delimitations as to availability, and even individual records, metadata records. For example, if you say in the metadata record that an analysis of a particular infectious disease took place in the township of X, well, the implication is that maybe there's an infectious disease problem of that type in that particular village. So, in fact, one of José's jobs is to go through the metadata records and check for those ethical questions to minimize and hopefully eliminate some of those misinterpretations, but still allow access to the data provider. And this was true in the social sciences as well. There are private conversations, for example, with individual Inuit. Some of the data sets involve interviews and videos, but it was on the basis that those interviews and data sets not be placed into the public domain. So one has to be really respectful about each of those. So just to wrap up then, I guess another point I should make is that funding is always an issue. When we started 10 years ago, there was no funding allocated at all or even considered within a budget for NSERC. And a lot of our initial work was really in an informal way. As time has gone on, there's a realization that this is a key element of any research program, and there should be a budgetary line in your proposal that relates to good data management. So there are good and bad models out there. We'd like to emphasize the good. I think we can do a lot better these days. And there are many reasons, actually, to care about data management if you're a researcher. There has to be something in it for the researcher, of course. And part of that is if there's a requirement there, or if there's a way to collaborate and exchange data, learn more about your own work from that data sharing. Polar Data Catalog, we've learned a lot in the evolution of this process, and it's continuing to evolve, and it's now a way to exchange data. And we've learned that there are many issues that need to be addressed, from all the way from funding to really this idea of sitting around the table and sharing different approaches towards data management and what's possible and what's not possible. And at the end of the day, this question of respecting the people who've worked hard to generate those data, and also to apply respect in terms of what you do with the data subsequently as you tap in to these increasingly rich resources. So with that, thank you very much. In closing, I'd like to thank our incredible Paula data catalog team with Julie Friedel here at Waterloo and her team, and José Michaud and colleagues at ArcticNet, and our many funding partners. And thanks to all of you for this opportunity to exchange today. Thank you. Yeah, so that is a concern. Now, in the case of GenBank, you're using specific accession numbers, and so in your synthesis, those accession numbers will be placed in your graph or your table, and then by clicking on those, you'll go straight into the metadata, which includes who collected that data in the first place. We're not there yet, of course, with all these other data sets. And so I guess that is a concern, and as these data sets become larger. The DOE is on the other hand a good way into that, because then you've got the core data, the individual components of those core data in an initial reference location, and again that can be attributed. But it's a really important question, and it's a stumbling block to I think to a lot of researchers buy into the process of data sharing. We talked about this, how long do you hold on to data before there should be a requirement that it go into the public domain? Our decision within ArcticNet was that it should be 3 years after the end of a particular project. And typically our projects are for 4 years or for 3 years, because there are challenges there in ensuring that those data sets do eventually come out. And there will be certain data sets that do not and should not be made available in the public domain if there are confidentiality aspects, privacy elements, etc. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's a lot of acid-free paper to get everything down, right? And so we need to grapple with that program. And the feedback I've had recently from the Paula data catalog people is that increasingly data managers are looking towards keeping the data sets live. The DOE is one way of doing that. So instead of storing it on your floppy disk, your 8-inch floppy disk, or your zip disk, who can read a zip disk these days? The data are continuously in a particular location and are continuously updated as these new storage mechanisms come along, with the appropriate backups as well. The DOE is an interesting approach, and there seems to be some flexibility there. The way we would like to view that is sort of like Wikipedia, where if you're updating a data set, you also explain how that update took place. So when you go into the data set, you see the history of that data set, and you can go back into an original version, but you may see that there was a calibration, for example, that took place in 2013, and then that was applied to data sets subsequently. And that can be critically important, those sorts of issues, as we know. Stratospheric ozone, when it was detected by satellite, was thought to be an error. And there was a continuous offset that was made in the NASA satellite because of this sense that something was not working quite right. And so you need to be able to know what are those calibrations and what is the history of the data set. So the continuous upgrade would seem to be one way of addressing that very important issue. Well, what I like about the library community is that there's this long-term perspective. Since millennia, actually, it's the aim, and also libraries have a long history of interacting with users by definition. And so that's an extremely valuable collaboration for sure.
One of the things.
That's a big issue for sure. And that also comes into that liability question. I mean, as a data manager, you cannot be responsible for the quality of every single data set. You don't know what the quality is. I think as a data manager, the responsibility there is to make sure that there is sufficient metadata so that somebody else can stand back and say, okay, well, that was the method that was used. We now know that method is suspect. or we realized that that method was good to within an order of magnitude, but we should be careful about interpreting that relative to a more recent trend. And we see many, many examples of that in the natural sciences. For example, metals in the ocean. That's the analysis, the chemical analysis in the ocean of trace metals has gone from chaos at the part per million to order at the nanogram level over the course of decades as analytical techniques have become better. But on the other hand, some of that early data is very useful as well. So quality is important, and that's another part of respecting the data as well, respecting the fact that things have been collected in different ways, and people have worked to their limits, but that's going to impose also constraints on how you interpret those data sets. Yeah, that's very interesting, and that also gets back to this question of what happens if you change the calibration. So raw data is optimal, but typically people are wanting more developed products. So next generation products that use that raw data and produce it in a form that can then be incorporated into a larger synthesis or a comparison. So you can imagine a lot of basic readouts of instruments are not actually very useful until they have a calibration, but you need to know what that calibration is. So again, that's where the metadata becomes very important in knowing how the data were collected and how it was then transferred into the next level of data.